complaint about possibly having this training for 2.5 hours on a mini adoption day. Both the training committee and Mr. Krikorian thought this was important enough of a topic that we address it. I think when you listen to our speaker, you will understand that it cannot be addressed in a 1-hour MCLE, especially because of the clientele that we serve. It's very important that we deal with this topic. And according to Mr. Krikorian, even though it's a mini adoption day, it is a work day. So hopefully you will pay attention and get as much as you can out of this training. You all need a bias training for the MCLE, and you will get that with this training. Okay, now Ms. Brewer is going to introduce our speaker.
So we are lucky to have Kenjus with us today. I was tasked with writing up a synopsis in the email that you guys all got this morning of his CV, which is 10 pages long. So it was no easy task. He's definitely an expert in implicit bias, microaggressions, so I'm very excited to have him here today. We actually went to undergrad together, so I've known him for quite a long time. He does a lot of these talks and trainings, and he specifically tailored this one today to dependency and the work that we do.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is a large group in a small room. So I'm really excited to be here with you all, especially given the work that you do. I work with folks across the spectrum on the issues of bias and microaggressions. Currently, I teach at Occidental College in the education department, help train future teachers there. I work with the Black Male Institute at UCLA and do a lot of trainings for LAUSD, and now at a national level working with different school districts on issues of bias. I've done work with the LA Public Defender's Office, and that stems from the other work that I do, and that's teaching inside juvenile facilities. Now I work within Silmar's Barry J. Nidor's juvenile facility. So I teach kids on the inside, I teach students on the outside, and I work with professionals around these issues. I think what you all do is incredibly important. And what I did today is, in prepping for this, is talk with some folks from LATO. I also talked with folks who I think impact the work that you do. So, social worker from DCFS, and I also talked with someone from the Children's Law Center. So to try to get a sense, given that it's not necessarily my field, how do we see bias moving across these different spaces, and what might we be able to do against it? I'm going to talk about microaggressions and implicit bias. I'm going to introduce the concepts to us just so that we're all on the same page. We'll have about an hour, get into it for about an hour, and we'll have a break, and then we'll end with some discussion about what we might be able to do around these issues. My experience around these issues, race, gender, sexuality, class, is that when we're engaging with each other around these issues, it's probably best that we have some kind of guiding ground rules or discussion guidelines, just in case we do have a conversation that something emerges. And for me, that's stemmed from some of the ground rules that I've developed with other groups over time. We're not necessarily going to have a dialogue here, but just in case, I think it'd be helpful for us to follow some of these guides. So I'm going to ask, to the extent that it's possible, that if individuals share individual stories, experiences, perspectives in here that are particularly sensitive, that they remain confidential. They stay within this room. But that being said, what's shared here should stay here, but what's learned here hopefully can like leave here, right? The concepts and conversations can go. I'm going to ask that we're present, that we suspend some of our judgment of each other, and the concepts or perspectives that are emerging from the presentation, that we are actively listening to each other, in particular, the stories being shared. And that'll mean that there's some risk involved in here, but it requires us to really be honest. If the conversation is comfortable, meaning if we all feel really good about like working through these issues, I feel like we haven't gone quite far enough. These issues are, for lack of a better term, just uncomfortable realities that we have to sort of contend with. So I'm going to ask that we challenge ourselves to lean into some discomfort, some spaces where different ideas or frameworks are being shared that are challenging us, my belief is that that means we're in a really good place as far as a learning edge. So I'm going to, just ask that you all attempt to do that. And then finally, I think it's important to have a sense of respect for each other, and if people are willing to go to different places, to maybe try to reciprocate that by meeting them there. Most of it will be just talk to your partner and neighbor, but again, that requires a sort of reciprocal engagement. And my other feeling about this, if we do this work well, if we're talking about issues of bias in ways that are actually effective, then it means that there's going to be some places where we're noticing our complicitness in bias, past, present, and then thinking about our future challenges. And that means that we're going to be in this constant process of forgiveness of self, and then working on accountability with self and others. That's my feeling about this, right? When I do this work, we often call it like windows and mirrors. We get a window in other people's perspective, but then the challenge of bias, if I were just come here and say, oh, look, I'm going to tell you all this and it's going to be fine. That's not really how it works. The challenge of bias is to actually hold a mirror up to ourselves. I don't know about you all, but when I'm looking in a mirror, it's typically by myself, right? Not in front of my colleagues and work friends, right? So that's a challenging reality, but I think it's one that we need to embrace as we talk about issues of racism and sexism and classism and how they relate to the folks that you all serve. Sound good? Any additions from you all that you think are important for us before we go forward? Okay, cool. So I want to start with some basic definitions. This is a scene, maybe it's familiar to some of you all, maybe you've been involved in this scene before, but I want to just get a sense of what you see happening. Now, you all remember the show, What Would You Do? Yeah? Okay. So I imagine a scene as a what would you do moment, okay? So I'm going to invite us all into this space and set this up, okay? So this person, my pointer doesn't work on the screen. Person at the top of the screen is one of our actors, okay? They're a Confederate in our little experiment. Person at the bottom of the screen is the non-actor, okay? They are the one we're doing the experiment with. And if you can't tell, that person's going to cross the street. Okay, let's say the what would you do cameras jump out right after they cross the street. Okay, and say, why did you cross the street? Right? What do you think the person on the bottom of the screen is going to say? I got a lot. You say one at a time, maybe. Wanted to be safe. Something could happen. Okay.
You think they'd be that honest and say what they really felt? I don't think
they'd be honest?
They say, I wanted to get out of the sun, or I changed my mind, I want to go to a store that's on the other side of the street. How much honesty do you get from somebody if they're truly biased?
Right, I mean, if he said this, I want to be safe, I mean, that would be like that.
But you have to know Drew
Right.
would say that. He's not normal.
Okay. Yeah.
Why did I say it would depend on who was asking him the question?
Okay, all right, so who's behind the what would you do camera? Let's assume it's the person who's always behind the, I forget his name. Yeah, he's
John Stuff.
So why did you cross the street? Okay, so he says, we say I want to be safe, probably not going to say that. You said maybe I was going to that store.
They're going to lie, they're not going to be honest.
Right.
Unless they're looking in the mirror alone and you're not there and nobody's there, they're going to say, oh my God,
Okay.
I didn't cross fast enough.
Good.
If they're really fearful.
Good. All
Not
right.
right.
Yeah, I thought that was my car. I cross the street every 30 seconds, I have OCD, Like anything but a perfectly logical explanation, anything but, something that has anything to do with bias. And absolutely it depends on the context and who's asking and everything like that. And that gets at what implicit bias is about and why the theory and concept emerged really in the late 70s. And it's something you all may be familiar with, right? You have the 1976 Washington v. Davis case. And that helped establish the intent doctrine. Then the first study on implicit bias comes out in 1977. Right, literally right after that intent doctrine is established, it says if there's some moment of discrimination, we have to have some reasonable intention that's involved in that moment of discrimination. And so then we started looking at what if we can't discern intention? What if intention or stated intention or even conscious intention doesn't necessarily align with the action or the outcome? right? In potential discrimination spaces. In Washington v. Davis, of course, we talk about education. So in implicit bias studies, we're trying to discern, regardless of explicit intent, what is behind this person's movement, right? Regardless of what they're saying, their intention. If you ask them in that moment, if maybe they're extremely honest and like, I want it to be safe, and I've internalized an understanding that dark people are less safe, so I cross the street, right? Unless they're that honest, they're going to have other kinds of explanations. Try to think of this in a larger societal perspective. Take this street scene, multiply it across the country, different contexts, different situations, and we'll kind of run into this issue over and over again, because the 1960s gave us some pretty powerful legislation that shifted our understanding of what is acceptable in the social sphere and what is not acceptable. Does that make sense? Now, recent events have challenged that acceptability, but it still remains the case that it's pretty difficult to just name that you are involved in some moment of discrimination and be proud of that and be accepted socially. So we have all of these really powerful motivators to not necessarily even be honest with others, but actually not even recognize our internalization of a problematic history that we're involved in here in the country. So when we're thinking about implicit bias, we're thinking about the intention of the actor behind a potential issue of discrimination. Okay? We're thinking about whether or not their intent aligns with the action, and if it doesn't, well, we need some way to kind of figure out and measure that, and that's where implicit bias studies come into play. Now, I'm going to reshift our focus in the same scene. We'll do what would you do. Remember, the first time our focus was on this person at the bottom of the screen. They were our target of the experiment. Now we're going to swap roles, okay? This person now becomes our actor, okay? The person at the bottom of the screen is our actor. So that means our focus now shifts to the person at the top of the screen. Now, if we're thinking about intent and implicit bias, we're thinking, oh, how is this person involved in discrimination? Why are they doing seemingly discriminatory acts but not able to name it even for themselves? In explicit measures, they don't report that they're involved in discrimination. Well, that's implicit bias. If we think about microaggressions, we're thinking about what's happening to the person at the top of the screen, right? So let's flip this. Okay, what would you do now? Person at the bottom of the screen is the actor. Person at the top of the screen is our target of the experiment. And same situation. Person at the bottom of the screen crosses the street. What would you do, cameras? Jump out right at that moment, ask the person at the top of the screen, hey, how do you feel about what just happened? What do you think they say?
Same old, happens all the time.
Yeah.
You know how they are.
I think that's what he would say, probably. Just like that, yeah. Right? Any other?
You should have crossed the street and followed the guy that was crossing. But it also depends, like, okay, I hate to say this. It depends. No, it depends too, some of the biases, if you're on this street and you're in certain areas, and people may react differently too in the areas that they're crossing the street in because of the implied biases. And then I have a second question when you finish this. Let's say you have, because I like to jump around, you know when you do something you shouldn't do it because it's an implied and biased act within you. But you don't want to do it, but you do it because of the way you feel. How do you get out of that way feeling? You stay on that side of the road and then walk and say, hi, how are you?
Oh.
But, I mean, you know, sometimes we have these things, we really don't want to do it, but we do it because we still have fear, because we're not really sure.
So you accommodate,
yeah. Okay, if I saw somebody, let's say, in an area where I'm very familiar with the surroundings, and the crime rate is, let's say, not too high, but I know that if I get lost on the freeway, and it's happened to me with my husband, and we get into an area that I said, find me a gas station, get me off, and I know I shouldn't be acting that way. How do we get rid of those feelings? Because I don't want to feel that way, but I know I'm feeling that way, and that's when I look in the mirror, I don't want to be that way, but I'm that way.
Yeah,
and I don't want to reflect that and have people that
I understand what you're saying. Essentially, you're saying, how do we rid ourselves of the bias? Absolutely. Especially if you're aware of it. That you're tapping into a concept we'll call that like even reverse stereotype threat. That is something that folks study. When we're aware that there is a potential bias incident and we overcompensate in multiple kinds of ways to deal with that potential bias incident, like this person says, "Hi, how are you? How's it going?" Right? Instead of crossing the street because they're going, "I don't want to be involved in this," right? Yeah. So and that's also a part of this too. The reality is that as far as ridding ourselves of bias, that's going to be a long process, but we'll get to some strategies, at least for decreasing the amount of bias that we have. But just being aware of them is a protective factor against them, right? So if we're all sort of aware of the fact that we have bias, and we're able to name
But
that.
there's much bias with the newer generation, the real 20s and 30s, more with the 80s and 90s bias, or in the middle.
Yeah, recent
You
studies.
find that it's decreased as people have gotten older and been educated, let's say. My children would be educated a certain way, my great-grandchildren, you know, I don't feel like guys, but there's just ways if you grow up with people that are really old
Yeah.
from where they come from.
Yeah,
You understand what I said?
yeah, stereotypes change, but you'd be surprised at how consistent and persistent they are over time. So there are studies on the current millennial generation, and it shows they have similar levels of bias of people, the baby boomers and the folks who came before them as well. Now the understandings of the stereotypes shift over time, but they remain sort of persistent. Unfortunately, that's our challenge, right? We'll talk about why that is the case going forward.
I'll be quiet.
No, that's great. That's great. So same old, right? That's what the person would say. Maybe I didn't even notice it happened, right? Or perhaps maybe that same old is it comes tied with a feeling of resolve and resistance. Like I'm going to keep doing what I need to do to move down this street or move down the path of life, regardless of what people do. Right? We know those are ways that people respond to these situations. But what we study, or what I really focus on in my work, is the impact of these moments that happen on a seemingly day-to-day basis, an incessant basis. And that's the microaggression. So microaggressions work is about the impact. Implicit bias is about intent. Microaggressions are about impact. Are we all clear on that? So we're discerned. So implicit bias is the event. It is what happens. The microaggression is how that happening or that moment impacts the person. Now we track that across a number of different variables. It's psychological, emotional, physical. I look at physiological health. And it's pretty, it is a growing area of research when we're looking at the physiological response of this, and none of it's good. I should also preempt this talk. Very little of this is like uplifting, okay? Most of it, I wish I had better news for you all. And I wish that we could solve racism and sexism in about 2 hours, but we're not going to, right? I want to preempt our expectations of this. We'll give some skills about how we can decrease bias, we'll be aware of microaggressions, and then we'll collaborate on how we can intervene at different levels across the placement pipeline.
Are you going to address, and then I'll be quiet, guys. Are you going to address the issue without implying any of our hearing officers are biased in any stretch of the imagination? But many times you have a case where kids have been placed, they're African American kids, if the parents are in the system, their kids have been taken away, and placed in a white family. You come down to a 2-6, and you come down to a hearing where we're trying to get to relatives that are obviously 99% are African American, and you sometimes get the sense that when you're trying to argue the importance of being with their relatives, and sometimes people will say culture, but you know deep down the hearing officer is not biased by any stretch, but you know when they're sitting and doing, because the life has been so wonderful in this one family, and you know the African American family maybe they're educated and work and do this and that, but the other family is just like, storybook. How do you, if you can, how do you address it without trying to claim that the hearing officer doesn't realize that maybe they're looking, that they shouldn't be looking at maybe the color of the skin as much as the importance of being with their family? I mean, I know this hits some attorneys in cases that deep down that's what's going on, and you can't really say, but Your Honor, I think you should look beyond the color of the skin. It's important here, even though they can go to Disneyland every day over here. This is where they should be. I'd like you to address that at some point so we don't look like we're insulting anybody that's doing the case. Do you understand?
Yeah, I understand.
It's like implied, and that's...
Yeah. I would argue that that's not necessarily looking beyond the color of the skin. It's actually uplifting the importance of race and race socialization in the lives of a young person, right? That race, we have plenty of opportunities to see that race serves as protective factors against other kinds of potential harm. Not solely on its own, but we know that having folks who have a cultural competence and understanding, awareness, and a connection is more helpful than not. And around issues of bias in the courtroom, we'll get to that later, but some of the suggestions coming out of research, folks, legal scholars are saying that actually you should be uplifting and really drawing attention to race in these different spaces, that is helpful in different cases. Not going around or talking sort of in analogies, but being very direct about the realities of race. And hopefully what we get here can kind of help with that process. Okay? All right. So I just want to be clear. We're clear on microaggressions, implicit bias distinctions. Okay. All right. So I work with folks and we define microaggressions as a form of systemic, everyday oppression that's used to keep those on the margins in their place. Okay? They can be verbal or nonverbal assaults directed towards marginalized groups, often carried out in subtle, automatic, or unconscious forms. They can be layered based on a person's race, their gender, their class, sexuality, language, immigration or documentation status, phenotype, accent or surname, other aspects that layer onto this, okay? And we feel like they have a cumulative impact, meaning over time they add up, they accumulate, and they take a physiological, psychological, and academic toll on folks, right? This is directly involved in people's health. So I want to be clear about what microaggressions are and sort of a model that we've developed, right? So microaggression exists within our larger frame of society. Think of it as an everyday reminder of what your people have been through. So you have microaggressions that exist within institutionalized oppression. There's a perpetrator who may or may not be aware that they're a perpetrator. That's the bias person, right? Think back to the example we showed. And they'll send some kind of microaggression to the target, the receiver. And we'll talk about secondary targets in a moment. Let's say the microaggression from the perpetrator says, hey, he's the first African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. You know whom we're talking about and who said this?
Joe Biden said.
Joe Biden. Yeah. About Barack Obama. Okay. Sounds like a compliment, right? He's the first, mainstream, whatever that means, right? Who's articulate and bright. So he says it, and Obama goes, hey, Joe, that hurt my feelings, when you said that, okay? So he sends back, I don't like that you said that, Joe. And Joe goes, oh, that's not what I meant, right? Try to imagine yourself. You've been in these scenarios like this, right? That's not what I meant. I meant it as a compliment. Barry, right? We're friends. You're being too sensitive. You're being too sensitive. It was just a joke. I wasn't really being serious. It was just a joke. All right. So that is typically how a microaggression occurs. And you see how insidious and ambiguous that is. Now, obviously, Biden got up and said that in front of the whole world. Typically, this happens when it's just you and the other person. Or maybe it's a group of other people and you. Or maybe there's a lot of yous and just one other person, right? And there isn't someone documenting that, but something happens and there's sort of a pause. Did that just happen? Right? So it's not like the primary target responds right away. In fact, the primary target might be trying to make sense of what happened in that moment. The secondary target might be people watching it on TV, right? I can't believe Biden just said that, and your heart rate jumps, right? I think about this going into Target. I know I don't wear a red shirt when I go to Target, okay? Because I don't know where stuff is in the store. Only when I get asked to take people to where they need to go, right? So I know. I do it for them, for other people. Like, I can't really help. Now, when it does happen, and I fail to wear a red shirt, oops, I'm wearing a blue shirt today. Oh well, I'm still working at Target, I guess, right? Get asked to find, where's the laundry detergent? Where's this? I might take them to a different part of the store, and they go, why'd you take me here? Well, I don't know, but I have a PowerPoint I can show you about what just happened. A whole dissertation. So that might be my response, My response is doing the work, research. Other people don't necessarily have the same kinds of planned responses. And I think about that person at the top of the screen. Now, street harassment, one level, right? We know that happens in that way and racially. There's a study that was done recently where women who said that they were harassed on the bus, those who said they were more harassed on the bus, had higher rates of breast cancer, right? There's a correlation between the impact of these everyday moments and then our health, okay? So knowing how to respond is important. And when you respond to the people, what are your expectations about their ability to receive it? Now, we're all being educated around this now, so hopefully someone says, hey, that was a microaggression. It's not like a major attack. It's like, hey, did you notice that, what just happened right there? And because we're all sort of wrapped up in this in multiple ways, because it can be layered, right? Layered. So just because I'm a black person doesn't mean I'm not also engaging in microaggressions with or bias against other people, right? Including other black folk, right? Depending on our different identities. It might be around gender, it might be around sexuality, it might be around class. It'd be problematic if I said, how dare you assume I work at Target? Target, you know? That's a problem, right? That's a problem, right? Are you all with me? Okay, all right. So Chester Pierce developed this concept before implicit bias. Implicit bias studies 1977. Pierce actually published on this on microaggressions in 1969. He was a psychiatrist in Cambridge. He worked at Harvard. He helped break the color line, played for Harvard, their football team, and went on to study stress and the impact of stress on the body. If you want to know what happens if you're in situations, he also worked for NASA and did studies on folks who were preparing to engage in space travel, or preparing to live in Antarctica, or preparing to be submerged in a submarine. So Pierce's work was focused on what happens to the human psyche when we're in situations that could possibly kill us, right? And then he applied that to his clientele. He's a black person again, and his clientele were black people living in Cambridge in 1969, 68, 67. And they were telling Pierce, hey, no one's saying the N-word to me, but I'm being treated that way. And, well, what is that? What is that? And that's where he developed the term of microaggressions. Okay, and he said that the microaggressions it's micro in name only, since their very number requires a total effort that's incalculable. So I want to be clear, because this comes up with nomenclature when we talk about microaggressions. It's like, oh, this is small. That's not what was intended by microaggressions. It doesn't mean small. It means everyday, mundane, incessant, insidious. You have a major event, right? A major event. Tamir Rice being killed, Trayvon, major event. A microaggression is an everyday reminder, not those major events, but these everyday reminders of what your people have been through or are going through. Okay? So an everyday reminder is, English, you need to speak English. I went to a Philly cheesesteak place in Philadelphia, right? There's two that sit across the street, and one says, we only talk to you if you speak English, right? That's an everyday reminder for folks. Y'all with me? What's that one? There's Geno's East. Eat at Geno's East. Don't eat at the other one. All right. So the impact of microaggressions, again, stress leading to susceptibility to illness. It affects emotional well-being, our psychological adjustment, our mental health, the energy expended to make sense of what happened. Okay, that's a lot of psychological energy that we're drawing on. Hypervigilance, forced compliance, rage, hopelessness, and many folks strength through adversity. You find people in a room who may have been targeted of all this stuff, and there are rooms like this, well, you know they've been through something, right? And they've had to develop some coping strategies to make it to the spaces that you're in, right? This study found, this is 2015, the researchers found that adults who reported higher levels of discrimination when they were young had disrupted stress hormone levels some 20 years later. And as young, they meant like 7, 8, 9. I was experiencing discrimination when I was 7, high levels when I was 10, etc. That means by the time that they were 30 years old, they had higher levels of resting cortisol, higher levels of adrenaline. And you know over time that impacts your body's ability to be sustained. Okay? I study telomeres. The telomeres are the protective caps at the ends of a chromosome. They're kind of these blue tips here. Inside the nucleus of a cell sits a chromosome, right, with all these different base pairs. Telomeres are these tips that protect the cell as it replicates. What we're looking at right here is life. Okay, this is life and aging. And as our cells replicate, our telomeres degenerate. I like to think of them like the plastic tips at the ends of our shoestrings. So when those plastic tips get worn down, what happens to the shoestring? It frays, right? That's what happens at our cells, at a cellular level. So look what happens. And when our cells fray, and those telomeres get worn down, we get things like, wisdom and gray hair, and you know, cool glasses, mindfulness of our bodies, you know. So it's a natural way of marking biological age, because we have a chronological age. We've been on the earth for a certain amount of years, okay? Telomeres give us a sense of how old our cells are, regardless of how long we've been on the earth. And when we look at telomeres and something like race-related stress, those who report higher levels of racism or race-related stress or sex discrimination, their telomeres degenerate more rapidly, right? So this helps us account for some of the disparities in life expectancy, okay? So when I think about everyday microaggressions, I don't think of them as something small. Because that's not what Pearson intended, and because that's not what their effect is. I did a study with a group of young men, college-educated, highly successful and healthy young men, okay? Their telomeres, and they reported higher levels of discrimination, right, everyday discrimination. Their telomeres were shorter than a comparison group of black women over the age of 40 with breast cancer, okay? All these men were under the age of 26, okay? So that's cause for major concern and an intervention. And then I imagine other ways that trauma layers onto some of the young folks that you all are thinking about, the families that we represent, you know, right? All of us are kind of wrapped up in a world that's predicated by stress and trauma. So how we cope with that stress and trauma is really important. How do we uplift this into spaces of defense and strategy? I think that these are tools that we can utilize, right? So studies that show that bias and microaggressions are affecting health and our ability to cope well are important to mention. Okay, so we understand what microaggressions are. They're about the impact. Study the impact. Implicit bias is about the intent. Implicit bias are these attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an involuntary or unconscious manner. They are activated without our awareness or sometimes intentional control. They can be either positive or negative, and everyone is susceptible. I want to do a task, an experiment with you all. So I need participation. So yelling out is good here. I'm going to put up a Stroop task, okay? We'll call it colors. What I'd like for us to do is to, as a collective, read, I think we can see here, I think the screen will show it, but tell me the color of each, we're going to have these categories, and each word has a certain color. Pay attention to the color, not the word. You got me? Pay attention to the color, not the word. All right. So let's do number one together. 1, 2, 3.
Green, red, purple, green.
We'll call it purple. Okay. It's kind of funky on the screen. Okay, number 2. That was pretty good. You all did great. All right. Number 2.
Blue, yellow, blue, red.
And number 3.
Green, yellow, red, purple.
Purple. Good. Okay. That was pretty good. I give us like a 95%. You know, there was some confusion, maybe because the words are weird. All right, so we'll do part 2. Ready? Okay. Number 1.
Green, red, purple, green. Blue, yellow, blue, red. Green, yellow, red, purple.
I pledge allegiance to the... Okay. All right, last one.
Green, red, purple, green. Blue, yellow, blue, red. Green, yellow, red, pink.
Like D. So what happened? What happened?
Attention to the word.
We read.
I said color, not the word. But why did it get more difficult? Why did we get
Because we've been reading since we were 4 years old.
Been reading since we were 4 years old. We've been reading words. We've also been recognizing colors since probably before we were 4, right? So technically we should be better at colors than we are at reading, probably. What else do we think was involved in that?
Subconscious.
Social pressure, subconscious. Yeah, any and all. See, we all have a really effective computer that helps us do a lot of things, right? That's our brain, and it functions, or really we'll say computers function, or they're trying to function as effectively as our brains function. So right now you just utilize the most powerful instrument on earth and we all screwed up, okay? So either something's wrong with the mechanics, or there are these mitigating factors that are inhibiting our ability to do this effectively, okay? And this is a simple task with colors that we're all very familiar with that I don't think have very much social reality attached to them outside of the fact that the colors should match up with the words, right? We learned that the color yellow is spelled like this. Now, folks who speak more than English, right, or a different language than English, maybe it's more difficult, maybe not. Maybe you're probably better at this than many of us are, right? But notice how just that flick of a arrangement of letters, that's all it is, just an arrangement of letters, can change or inhibit our ability to do this simple task effectively, right now in the moment, with something that we've all been engaged with for most of us for our entire lives, and it has relatively low social risk. There are some social pressures, but everybody's saying it at one time. If I called her at one time and said, all right, you do this one, that might be more pressure, right? That's essentially what's happening around issues of race and gender and class. That's what we mean by implicit bias. I don't blame any of you all, meaning I gave you grades, but that's really a misnomer. It's not correct to give you a grade for that. I don't blame anyone for not being able to do this task effectively, because I know that there are disruptions in our abilities to do it effectively. That's how I think about, and how folks who do this work on implicit bias, that's how I think about bias. This activity comes from Jerry Kong, who one of the foremost experts on implicit bias, is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Equity at UCLA, and is one of the leading legal scholars on implicit bias and how they play a role in the courtroom. And he does this task, really cool TED Talk if you're interested, Jerry Kang, K-A-N-G, where he kind of discusses this whole thing. So for me, bias are these, everyday mental processes that cause us to have unconscious negative attitudes about socially marginalized people or groups. We believe that these biases are fueled by symbolic attitudes, so symbols that represent people, okay? Not actual individuals, but the symbols that we attach to people. When I walked in, before I spoke, before we engaged, there are all kinds of things that were happening for everyone, right? First time seeing me. Different symbols that you're reading on me and about me, whether you want to or not, because your computer's functioning, right? It's trying to locate, is that a bear or is that a human, right? Should I stay in the room or should I run, right? Like, that's important for us. Evolutionarily speaking, psychologically speaking, those shortcuts are effective ways of engaging. We all need to notice the color red, right? Hopefully we do, right? It'd be pretty problematic if we didn't. So these are tasks that help us, but they run amok because it's informed by a history that is contaminated, right, by inequality and injustice. That's the reality, and you all see this in your everyday, sure. So they come from a variety of sources, the messages that we get about people or groups. Usually from people that we trust from the earliest point of our interaction. Right around the time you were learning colors, right? Right around the time we were all learning colors, we started to learn to categorize people. I'm a big believer that difference is not a problem. Difference is never a problem. But the associations that we make with difference, the negative and positive distributions, the inequitable distributions of associations, those are what remain sort of challenging for us in our work. So we depict people of color, women, queer folks, right? Working class individuals, different communities as negative, as less than the norm in some way, shape, or form. And very few of us ever fit all of those norms. In fact, all of us don't fit any of what we would call the norm. And yet we all have an avatar, really, of what we think a person who has the greatest value and worth in our society is. And if a person doesn't fit that avatar, then we start having to do that same kind of like red, yellow, like trying to work out in our minds how this human being is in fact human and not something less than. Does that make sense? Okay. We won't do the task again. But thank you all for your participation. So the problem with implicit bias is that everybody has it, okay? They reside in our unconscious mind, for the most part. These aren't actively engaged. And there are people who are actively engaged in biases. I'm not really talking about them. I'm not talking about the folks who just outright say, I think women are awful, right? Like that would not be the folks that we're thinking. We're talking about everyday good people with good intentions. And when we look at what happens in these dependency cases, mostly folks with good intentions across the board, trying to do best for the families, the children, everyone, right? Across the, at least that's the information I got as I talked to different folks. So I'm talking about good folks with good intentions, but there are structures that are built in based on bias, and then we have our own implicit biases that impact us. And that's just the work. Who we interact with in this room, our colleagues, right? The folks that we engage with on a day-to-day, happens there too. How we think about the families and communities that we serve, happens there too, right? Y'all with me? Maybe you're saying it doesn't happen. Okay, cool, I believe you. You're good. The rest of us have a hard time with it, whether or not we notice it or not. Okay, so in some ways that's like a way out, like we all do this. So, but it's also for me a way towards responsibility and accountability. What are we going to do to do it less? So they don't fit our egalitarian ideas about race, class, gender, sexuality, and if we don't talk about it, I mean, how many of y'all talked about implicit bias or microaggressions this morning when you woke up, right? Yesterday? Last week? Every day, every day. Last week we talked about it, every day we talk about it, right? I recommend talking about it all the time, right? It's kind of like our society is sick, okay? It's actually sick, and we'll talk about why it's sick in a moment, but if our society's sick at all these different levels, it'd be a problem if we had something like AIDS, okay? Autoimmune disease, right? Deficiency disease. And one of the things that comes with AIDS is, you might die from a cold, right? A cold might kill you. Now, if I know that we have AIDS, and we're supposed to be like addressing that, but my remedy for that is to give you Vicks VapoRub, right? That's not going to affect the AIDS. Is that, y'all with me? So we have to kind of talk about what's the problem, what's the actual disease, not the symptoms. And actually we have to talk about the symptoms too. We have to actually be aware of it. You can't just ignore it. So my suggestion is that we talk about it as much as we can. So bias works because we have, I would argue, an environment that's built on inequality and injustice that fuels our negative symbolic attitudes, and that's where we get our implicit bias from. Those lead into prejudice and stereotyping, and that leads to discrimination, which helps reinforce the inequality and unjust society that we have. Okay? We go round and round. So we have to intervene at some point. How do we measure this, and how do you know I'm not just up here spewing, facts that aren't grounded? We've measured implicit bias with a task called the Implicit Associations Test. Now we've been doing this for about 30 years, and I'm going to show you a video about how it works. Anyone done the IAT before? Okay, cool. I'll ask you your scores in a moment.
Our problem is that the new American dilemma isn't so simple. We have all of these markers by which we can demonstrate that we're not the people we used to be. But we don't know the ways in which we're not such good people because that part is unconscious. You may think this about yourself, but is that really who you are? We actually created a test that measures bias. You see words that capture good and bad. You have to associate Yankees with good and Red Sox with bad. This is very easy for a Yankee fan. But when you tell them to associate Yankee with bad and Red Sox with good, that's an impossible thing for them to do. They can't do it. They'll make mistakes. They'll take a lot longer to do it, and so on. Take a test like this and now just replace Red Sox and Yankees with the groups black and white. Imagine that for half the trials on this test, you have to associate black with good whenever you see a black face or a word like love, peace, joy, friend, all these good things. And while you're doing that, you have to put white and bad together, and words that mean terrible things in the world, words like agony, devil, bomb, vomit. How hard is that for you to do, is the question. We're not talking about your conscious attitudes. We're not talking about your conscious beliefs. We're talking about something that you yourself may not necessarily know you have. For something like 75% of white Americans, it's very hard to put black and good together.
Yeah, she gave that stat about white Americans. I should also say that for black folks, now we struggle with implicit bias as well, and it's correlated with our levels of education. So the more educated we are, the more anti-black implicit bias we have. Okay? So it's directly correlated with our levels of education. For Latinx folks, now there's not really a proxy for the bias test for implicit association. Now you can go to implicit.harvard.edu and take a test. It'll take you about 7 minutes. Thank you. We were hoping to do it in this space. We didn't have the time or I guess the capacity or resources. I think this is probably the number one thing anyone should do if you're interested in bias. It kind of gives you a really quick glance at it. But thinking about what the IAT does, it helps us understand the reality of bias in our everyday life. So we have what we call category consistent pairing. All right? On this test, for race, the race IAT, which looks at dark and light faces, it's easier to associate beauty, gift, happy, joy, safe, intelligent, etc. with the lighter faces. It's also easier, meaning people do it faster. They associate words like filth, pain, hurt, sick, bad, ugly, dangerous, awful with dark faces. Okay? That's across the board. Category insistent pairings lead to slower responses to the implicit associations test. It's much more difficult. Similar to the task we just did with the words and colors, it's essentially the same exact task, right? Just applied to race. It's one on gender. Think about women and their careers. It's difficult to associate high-power careers, leadership, assertiveness, right, intelligence with who we categorize as female than it is with men, right? Latinx folks, it's kind of like the color kind of remains the same. They do want brown and lighter folks. They have this on multiple identities, okay? So they're pervasive, where it's easier, right? Easier. The majority of folks, about 72%, associate weapons and black together. 76% of those who've taken this test have difficulty associating positive aspects with those who are considered disabled. We have a difficult time associating positive aspects with those who are considered overweight, right? We have a harder time associating, again, positive or leadership qualities with women, and then we just saw the race example, and age is probably the largest effect. Older folks have no respect in our society, right? But so too do children, right? When we do this with children. Same exact kind of effect happens with young people. So if you're in the middle, you're great, right? You're doing good. But the question remains, these differences in milliseconds, right? That's a difference in milliseconds between white and good, black and good, right? There's 213 milliseconds between our ability to associate those. What do milliseconds do? Do they actually matter, okay? Well, they assign this with our explicit beliefs. So we ask people, how often do you think of people who are older as positive? How often do you pair those? They said, well, I pair it, 1.3 seconds. I could do that, right? I think I can do that. And then the actual finding is that it's 0.51 seconds. Like, it actually takes us more time to associate good with old. And across the graph there, race, sex, gender, and career. That ties into action. We say, well, how would you act towards these folk? How would you act? Well, I think I'll be non-discriminatory, I'll be egalitarian in all these different ways. But then we put them in scenarios, right? Actual scenarios. And this, like we do the crossing the street scenario. And we measure, how likely are you to cross the street? And you all may have heard some of these other studies that folks do. Name studies, right? We could just change the name on an applicant, on a resume, to a name that sounds ethnic, and you're less likely to call that person, right? In our spaces in education, black girls are viewed as less innocent starting at age 5. Less innocent than white girls starting at age 5. We know it's disproportionality in discipline, which ties into the overall justice system, right? And it's usually system-involved youth in other kinds of ways, foster youth, right? All viewed as less innocent, based on color, based on class. I said that weren't really positive findings from implicit bias. I'm waiting for the implicit bias study that comes out and says everything's good, everybody's great, everything's wonderful, right? There's no more problems. And additional studies give us a much more, I think, sobering picture. So darker people are seen as larger and more violent in general. Okay? People believe that darker people have a superhuman quality to themselves. Right? We ask them, do you believe that individuals can be harmed? The darker the person is that they're looking at, the less likely they feel they can be harmed. So we associate things like rigidity, resilience with darkness. There's an ape association and dehumanization along color and class. So the darker and poorer someone is, more likely we are to associate them with an ape or less than human. Mirror neurons. We look at, or folks who've done this, studies on implicit bias and so on, and so looked at how often do your mirror neurons, which are these neurons that fire when you see someone doing something that you do as well, right? Or you could experience as well. We call it the empathy neuron. Less likely to have empathy for darker women, right, than we are for white women. Less likely to have empathy. And they did this around women who said, I might not be able to have babies anymore, right? Less likely to have empathy for those women who are dark than light. And that, of course, is really problematic because black women have highest infant mortality rate, right? So what does that all mean for our healthcare systems? Around healthcare systems, for pain medication, darker people are assigned less pain medication. Right? In situations of emergency, how much pain medication you get in an urgent situation is correlated with how dark you are to the perception of the emergency responders. And that's a particularly interesting one because they followed up on this. They didn't just find the bias, they said, well, what's behind that bias? So they asked 3 groups, right? Folks who were engaged in emergency responding situations, physicians who have been serving for more than 10 years, and medical students. And they just asked them questions about race and biology. Like those 3 groups: emergency responders, medical students, right, on their pathway to in medical school, and then physicians who had been practicing. Those groups across the board said black people had thicker blood, denser bones, right, more resilient skin. All 3 groups. And that's the focus of it. They know about the body, I think, right? Just so you're clear, that's not true, right? Are we clear? That's not true. Okay, none of that is true. But where does that come from and how does it emerge? Well, Thomas Jefferson said all of those things in his Notes to Virginia, right? Every single one. So this is we talked about persistence. Those remain persistent to this day. Things that were written by the leaders of the country, right, hundreds of years ago, are with us today, like an echo, right? It's been passed down from person to person, state to state, right, region to region, and it impacts our everyday life, okay? So I think that's a good place for us to take a break, and then we'll come back in, let's say, 15, 20,
I think it's like also
15 minutes?
Once you go back, it doesn't go back.
You pause it?